Well, I was delighted to hear Peter's talk right before mine, because he set me up very beautifully for what I want to talk about with his discussion of money as, or the way that we feel about money as a contingent fact, a convention, rather than something that is fixed and permanent, the way that we feel about money, the way that we think about money. Because what I want to do today, and you will forgive me, I'm a lit professor, I'm going to remain fairly podium and textually bound. I have some long quotes, I like to get them right. So I'm going to stay here rather than sort of wandering entertainingly all over the podium. It's also safer when you're wearing stilettos. What I want to do today is to talk a little bit about the way that people in the 16th and 17th century wrote and thought about money, and particularly the way they wrote and thought about what we would call charging interest on a loan and what they would call usury, right? We all know, and one of the points of this talk is that the things that we all know to be true are usually incorrect. And so I want to spend a little bit of time this morning explaining to you why it is that what we all know about how people in the 16th and 17th century felt about usury is all wrong, or at least is worth questioning. So we're going to do literary detective work. We're going to see what happens when we think about an economic concept through the lens of literature rather than through the lens of pure economics, or as we often do with the early moderns, through the lens of theology. So we're going to use poetry to do it. And that means we're going to be looking at a lot of poetry, but are there any English majors or lit majors in the... Yeah, that's usually the incredibly, stunningly enthusiastic response I get at the material. Economists? Any economists out there? Yes? Yeah, okay, there you are. Right, there are usually a lot of English majors. So I promise you, one, it's poetry about sex and money, so you'll stay interested. And two, I'm going to work very, very hard to avoid using any English professor jargon. If I lose you at any point, please wave your arm around and ask me to backtrack. I will do that. But I think that I have edited all sort of technical stuff about iambic pentameter right the hell out of the talk, so don't think we're going to have that problem. So the goals for this talk are for you guys to walk away with some knowledge about what early modern people thought and wrote about money, particularly about usury, to widen your notions about where to look for discussions of important economic concepts. For example, if you are, say, writing about paying for mourning customs, it is useful to know that Victorian literature is filled with examples of paid mourners. And I also want you to see the value, sort of in a larger context, of questioning the things that everybody knows to be true. So, let's get started. Everybody knows that early modern Englishmen hated usury. That hatred is recorded in images like this one, with a sort of a grasping usurer over here, and there's a whole metaphor with dead pigs, which we're not going to get into. And in publication after publication, with titles like An Alarm Against Usurers, The Speculation of Usury, The Arraignment and Conviction of Usury. Plays like The Merchant of Venice, of which you have heard, and The Jew of Malta detail the evils of usury. Thomas Wilson's Discourse upon Usury calls for the death penalty for usury. And remember, usury is lending money and charging interest on it. That's all it is. Calls for the death penalty for usury, arguing that usurers are much worse than thieves or murderers. Nobody's surprised when we read this kind of thing. Everybody knows this is how early moderns, how 16th and 17th century people felt about usury. But the thing that everybody forgets is that there's actually a really complex argument raging in that period over the potential utility of usury. People were beginning to see that being able to lend money for interest was incredibly useful in business. They were beginning to argue about then its moral stature, right? If you were making money, if you were doing good things with the money that you were making by charging interest on a loan, maybe it's a little more morally complicated than just being bad. There were arguments about its theological interpretation and its legality. Even the definition of usury was in flux in the period, as theologians and merchants began to consider the possibility that usury didn't always conflict with the laws of God. Maybe it had something to do, they argued, with exactly how much you were charging for a loan. In general, in the period, right around 10% was kind of the tipping point for whether you were engaging in morally acceptable usury or morally unacceptable usury. And you will hear reflections of this now in contemporary debates about how much interest credit card companies should be able to charge on a loan. You will hear it even more in discussions about payday loan companies. Do you have, Canada have payday loan companies? Yeah, okay, you'll hear it there. We're going to look at poetry today because these changing attitudes towards usury and profit combine with the rich language that's available in financial terms to provide irresistible poetic fodder, particularly for talking about sex. Early modern poets love to write about sex all over the place. They like to make puns about sex all over the place. So when you have financial terms like spend and use and commerce, all of which were also sexual terms in the time. Spend means the male orgasm, use means to engage in sexual activity, commerce means to engage in sexual activity. You would have commerce with a prostitute, right? This kind of richness of terms is enormously tempting for poets to play with and to use in their poetry. Now, when early modern love poems in particular use financial terms, it's most often these terms associated with usury and making profit. We can blame Aristotle for this. Everything's always Aristotle's fault, this too. Aristotle wrote about the practice of usury, that the most hated sort of money-making, and with the greatest reason, is usury, which makes a gain out of money itself and not from the natural use of it. For money was intended to be used in exchange, but not to increase an interest. And this term, usury, which means the birth of money from money, is applied to the breeding of money, because the offspring resembles the parent. Wherefore, of all modes of making money, this is the most unnatural, right? So usury is forcing something that is barren to reproduce, and it's all very sort of morally nasty. Right? It's an inappropriate kind of reproduction, it's an inappropriate kind of breeding, and Aristotle brings that sexual increase and that financial increase right together. 16th and 17th century picks up on this with enormous enthusiasm, and you see this vivid imagery of connecting breeding and birth and sex and reproduction with the charging of interest all over the place. It lingers in the background of Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice. By the way, everybody also knows that Shakespeare hates usury and charging interest and markets. We're going to come back to that. Just remember that everybody knows he hates it. We see it particularly in Shylock's discussion with Antonio about charging interest. Antonio says, is your gold and silver ewes and rams? Do your gold and silver reproduce naturally like sheep? Shylock says, I cannot tell. I make it breed as fast. His unnatural reproduction of money through the charging of interest treats an infertile object, money, like a fertile natural object, sheep, right? And so we know from that very moment that Shylock is bad and evil and unnatural, and it all goes to hell from there. The connection between sex and usury in Merchant of Venice is unrelievedly negative. The play adopts Aristotle's imagery, picks it up wholehearted, just puts it right back down in the play. That is what we all think is going on in 16th and 17th century discussions of lending money for interest. However, if you start poking around a little further in early modern poetry, you can really start to question what everybody knows. Marlowe's long poem, Hero and Leander, is probably the best place to begin looking at the great early modern economic pickup line. And you guys should all have in your folders, I think, a handout from me that has some poetry. You have it out. I don't know if that's awesome that you have that out already. Thank you. That has some of the longer quotes that I'm going to be talking about this morning that should be in front of you. Quote number 1 is what I'm about to talk about from Hero and Leander. Moments after Leander meets Hero outside of the Temple of Venus, and has had the incredibly erotic experience of hearing her speak and touching her hand, after which it's all over. They're passionately in love. he begins to try to persuade her to give up her job, which is being a Vestal virgin. Very inconvenient job for your girlfriend to have. And what's interesting is that Leander grounds his argument about why Hero ought to have sex with him in economic theory. He says, and this is on the sheet, I'm going to read it though because it's fun. What difference between the richest mine and basest mold but use, right? Use as in using it and also use as in using it. For both not used are of like worth. Then treasure is abused when misers keep it. Being put to loan, in time it will return us 2 for 1. Rich robes themselves and others do adorn, neither themselves nor others if not worn. Who builds a palace and rams up the gate shall see it ruinous and desolate. Ah, simple hero, learn thyself to cherish. Lone women like to empty houses perish. Less sins the poor man that starves himself in heaping up a mass of drossy pelf than such as you. His golden earth remains, which after his decease some other gains. But this fair gem, sweet in the loss alone, when you fleet hence, can be bequeathed to none. Now, I like to call this either the great early modern pickup line, or if you will, Christopher Marlowe's Hey Girl moment. Hey girl, your beauty's like gold, you gotta let that circulate, right? It's no good if you keep it to yourself. You have to exchange this or it's not worth anything. It's just like money, baby. Marlowe argues that the only thing that distinguishes a valuable item from its less valuable counterpart is that it is put to use. Unused, a gold mine is just a pile of dirt. Unused, a beautiful young woman may as well be an ugly old maid. There is, Marlowe argues, no difference except in how they are put to use. Marlowe then suggests that part of the benefit of putting wealth or beauty into circulation is not just that it expresses value. It's not just that it's generous and appropriate as opposed to miserly. It's profitable, right? Through the charging of interest, money can return us 2 for 1. That's clearly a positive image of usury in poetry from the time. We all know everybody hates it. Maybe everybody's wrong. But crucially, this speech comes from the romantic hero, Leander, right? You will sometimes get this argument from villains as well in the poetry of the period. What's interesting about Hero and Leander is awesome. He's the guy everybody wants to be, right? And he's the one making this argument here. Now, I will grant you that some of his arguments are less appealing. Women in the room might not be that thrilled about being told that if we're not with a man, we're like an abandoned house or an unused gold mine. That's not exactly, 21st century libertarian feminism. We're going to ignore that for a minute because we're talking about 400 or 500 years ago, and you can only expect so much from Marlowe. But what is more interesting and more successful in his argumentation is when he argues, for example, that a miser who starves himself to death in order to save his money at least has one redeeming characteristic, right? When he's gone, his money can be inherited. Chastity, however, will die with Hero. So if she hoards it, if she remains a virgin for her entire life, it is more sinful for her to do that than it is for the miser to hoard gold, because nothing can happen with her chastity once she's dead. Her chastity is, as he says, sweet in the loss alone. Like a sealed candy bar, it can only benefit herself or anyone else if she is willing to open it. Now, it may be tempting to suspect Leander of some illicit motives in his speech to Hero. After all, he's talking about money and sex at the same time, right? This is, I'm sure, Dworski would be accused of this kind of thing all the time when you're talking about prostitution, right? Talk about money and sex at the same time. He must be suggesting something immoral. He must be trying to make a whore of her, or at least trying to insult her. But because Jaworski's argument about the virtue of exchanging money for sex as a purely, contractual, sensible, consenting adult thing to do was not available in the 17th century. Leander does the best thing available, which is that he says, virginity, although some highly prize it, compared with marriage, had you tried them both, differs as much as wine and water doth. It's not seduction that Leander's seeking. He's not merely attracted to Hero for temporary use. He wants marriage. He wants investment. He wants something of greater and more lasting value. This greater value is not just an accidental result of marriage. It's contingent upon it. He says base bullion, right? So the gold that we dig out of the ground, for the stamp's sake, we allow, right? The reason that we dig gold out of the ground is so we can stamp it into coins and then it's worth something. Even so for men's impression do we you, by which alone our reverend fathers say women receive perfection every way. A woman, argues Marlowe and Leander, is not complete, has not fulfilled one of her main reasons for being unless she is engaged in producing of children. Again, not exactly feminist, but I would argue a positive representation of both sexuality and of money. Now, James Shirley, who is the second long quote on the, we don't want to go there yet, we'll go back. James Shirley, who's the second long quote on the handout, explores this notion that use will not only lead to pleasure and profit, but at least some of the lover's many desires on the desire for children. Thomas Carey's A Rapture, which is a little bit of which is also on the sheet, gives a fine example of this enthusiasm. The Rapture begins its seduction with economic imagery, which is going to start sounding really familiar to you guys by now. He talks about removing her dress and says, "There I'll behold thy bared snow and thy unbraided gold. There my enfranchised hand on every side shall o'er thy naked polished ivory slide. No curtain there, though of transparent lawn, shall be before thy virgin treasure drawn. But the rich mine, to the inquiring eye, exposed, shall ready still from mintage lie, and we will coin young cupids." The attractions of Celia's mine in this poem are much the same as the attractions of the mine listed in Love for Enjoying. It's not available to just anyone. He expects to have exclusive rights over it. He expects the production of enormous added wealth. But for Carey, the real payoff from his lover's gold mine is that he and she will coin young cupids. They will make children together. And those children will be like additional wealth. They will be the profit from the relationship. As with Leander's specification that he's seeking marriage with Hero, not just sex, this focus on reproduction and children helps to complicate potential accusations that these poems are merely about the blind gratification of male lust, or about using a woman as another in a series of commodities. Now, it's in Shakespeare's sonnets, yay Shakespeare. Remember, Shakespeare hates usury, right? We all know that because everybody's read The Merchant of Venice. It's in Shakespeare's sonnets that we find the most famous and extensive use of this idea of economic seduction with procreation as its explicitly sought after end. Shakespeare plays a lot in the first 17 sonnets of his sonnet sequences with words like waste, worth, treasure, sum, use, gold, spend, lend, loan, and increase. Contemporary literary critics have no idea what to do with this. They get really upset about all these financial words in love poetry. They say things like, it's somewhat disenchanting in the same way that Freud's insistence on the economic origins of happiness is, though it may have a certain wry and tough-minded wisdom. Another critic argues that this financial language is entirely inappropriate in love sonnets and would have been considered to be entirely inappropriate by Shakespeare's contemporaries. Contemporaries like Marlowe and Shirley and Carey, who use it all over the place. Everybody knows that money is dirty, not in the good way, right? Everybody knows that usury is really bad, and everybody knows that Shakespeare right? Our grand, if you know, our grand English literature sort of moral light hated them. But we can see now that far from being inappropriate, this use of economic terminology in love poetry is part of a contemporary conversation about sex and money and usury and exchange and profit. Sonnet number 4, which you have on your handout, is not shy about its economic preoccupations. The poem's very first word, unthrifty, is an economic term. And it's the first of 3 showy terms for the young person who is addressed in the poem. And it warns the readers that the poem is going to be troubled by contradictions, negations, and paradoxes. Unthrifty loveliness, why dost thou spend upon thyself thy beauty's legacy? We're going to leave that on the sheet, so I'm going to put it up here on the screen as well. The parts I'm going to talk about specifically should appear in red as we go through. The speaker is trying to figure out why the young man he's talking to refuses to have children. And he asks him 4 increasingly challenging versions of that question. Why won't you have kids? First version of the question, unthrifty loveliness, why dost thou spend upon thyself thy beauty's legacy? Demands to know why, since the young man is so beautiful, he refuses to pass that on to the future. Now there is an erotic pun here in the phrase, spend upon thyself. Now that we know what spend means. But this is more than just a joke about male masturbation, although it also is that. The accusation that the young man spends upon himself and thereby denies future generations their inheritance is an important economic argument as well. Unlike the chaste hero, who's accused of being a miser because she's hoarding her wealth, this guy is unthrifty. But rather than being unthrifty in appropriate ways, circulating his beauty through society, right, through having children, his giving and receiving, right, his copious spending, begins and ends with himself. So while he does not commit the grave sin of hoarding, he doesn't engage in trade or in exchange. He doesn't invest in the future. A legacy is supposed to be something that is inherently forward-looking and other-regarding, and the young man turns his back on himself. Nature, says the speaker, never intended you to behave that way. Your beauty is a bequest from nature. It is lent to you to produce future children. The speaker then goes on to demand, so beauteous niggard, why dost thou abuse the beauteous largesse given thee to give? Just identified as unthrifty loveliness, the young man is now beauteous niggard. We've flipped our terms around. His appearance is unchanged, but as the epithet reverses, so does the assessment of how the man spends his time. And he is, on the one hand, unthrifty. He spends excessively and inappropriately and on himself. He's also a niggard who is disinclined to spend at all. Spend though he may upon himself, none of it is anything but niggardly and ungenerous unless it will break him out of the cycle of self-regard and self-obsession. The poem's third question begins with probably the most important epithet, profitless usurer, which is, you will note, a self-contained contradiction. Usurers are defined by their profit-seeking and profit-creating behavior. To be a profitless usurer is to be very bad at being a usurer. Right? The oxymoronic nature of this epithet is heightened by its question. Profitless usurer, why dost thou use so great a sum of sums, yet canst not live? The young man's usuries are so poorly performed that he's unable to even eke out a subsistence. This is because he deals only with himself. He uses a great sum of sums, but since he lends to himself and from himself, there is no way to make a profit. There is no way to make the profit of, say, children from this kind of exchange, if it is only self-exchange. The incredulous speaker of the sonnet notes that because this closed circle is the extent of the young man's engagement with the world, having traffic with thyself alone, thou of thyself, that sweet self, dost deceive. He denies himself to others and denies to himself the pleasure and the profit of children. Behaving in this way, what can he expect to achieve? When nature calls you to be gone, what acceptable audit canst thou leave? Right? How are you going to explain yourself to nature when you die? And we end, of course, with the threat that you will just be locked into a tomb forever and nothing will be any good. This is familiar with Leander's explanation to Hero, that if she doesn't use her chastity now, it will just go to the grave with her and be useless. The speaker doesn't object to the young man because he's a usurer. He objects to him because he's a bad usurer. He doesn't make a profit from his usury. Usury requires exchange and transaction and engagement with the community. It's a social activity. The young man's behavior does none of those things. Far from being a critique of usury as a socially unacceptable, unnatural behavior, like the critique we got from Aristotle, like the critique that we got in, oh, what's that play, Merchant of Venice, by who? Oh, right, Shakespeare. This Shakespeare is telling us that usury can be social, can be productive, can be profit and society enhancing. Sonnet 6 comes back to these same topics, again in unabashed economic terms. Beginning with line 5, that use is not forbidden usury. The speaker plays extensively with images of breeding, of increasing future generations, of exchange among generations, and has a lot of fun with the 10%, the generally accepted 10% rate of usury / interest charged on a loan. The speaker explains to the young man that profit from procreation is not forbidden usury. This kind of profit is legitimate in sexual and financial sense. It produces legitimate children. It makes happier all who take part in it. The young man, the young woman, and also posterity, who will have the benefit of these beautiful children who will be produced. And the speaker gets so caught up in the image of all of this production that these wishes end up being more than fulfilled. And I had to call Horowitz and check the math on this, actually, because I don't really do math. With a 10% return on principal set as the standard acceptable rate, the speaker here envisions a loan that gets repaid at an ever-increasing rate. Initially, the loan was made for no gain beyond simple replacement, to breed another thee, it says in the poem. But the speaker's imagination runs away with him as he envisions the loan producing 10 children, which would repay the loan 10 times. As the speaker becomes further entranced, this multiple of 10 is increased by a multiple of 10, as the 10 imagined children each produce 10 children of their own. 10 of thine, 10 times refigured thee. And so the loan of the young man is paid 100 times over, with no illegality and no suffering. Indeed, the speaker asks, with a posterity like that, what could death do? Right? Instead of the threat of tombs and death that we often see at the end, and in fact we see it come back here, right here, if you produce those hundreds of children, if you produce that incredible posterity and profit, what can death do? How can it touch you? If you don't, be not self-willed, for thou art much too fair to beat death's conquest and to make worms thine heir. Right? If you don't do it, you're going to get eaten by worms. It's all going to be over. If you do it, profit all the way around. So it would be going too far to take the poetic representations of usury and lending at interest as a positive, or at least, oh, here's our money girls, or at least a potentially positive practice as firm evidence in a solid cultural shift. Right? This is not, we can't draw a bright line in the period when these folks are writing and say, prior to this line, everybody hated usury and charging money for interest. After this line, people think it's a good thing. But we can say that here is a moment when the voices in the culture are beginning to think about what usury means, what profit means, right? And are beginning to think about it in some potentially positive ways. And I think that that's really important for us to talk about, for all of us who are friends of free market and friends of things like charging interest on loans and all that good stuff, and friends of commerce, to think about. Because one of the things that resurfaces in culture periodically, and this is very much of what Peter's talking about, is this sense that money makes your hands dirty, right? That commercial exchange is somehow nasty and unacceptable. And it makes a good thing, like say a wedding speech, into an unacceptable thing, into an unclean thing, if you pay for it. This is a moment in the culture when those assumptions are clearly being questioned, are being put back on the table as things that are worth talking about. These poets are working on questioning and freeing themselves from that Aristotelian assumption that usury is the worst kind of money-making because it is like unnatural reproduction, because it is like unnatural sex. And the way that they are doing that is by joyously celebrating the pleasures of profit and of increase and of commerce in both their financial and their sexual needs. So I will leave it there, and if there are questions.